Hi BookTube, it's Amy. This past week I came across a book about books that I thought was worth sharing. It's not a long work. I think it took me an hour and a half, 2 hours at most, to leisurely read through this on my computer. I did read it in an ebook format because it was available through Project Gutenberg. I don't even remember the series of rabbit holes that brought me to this work, but one way or another I found myself reading a little work from 1901 titled Bookbinding and the Care of Books, a handbook for amateurs, bookbinders, and librarians, written by Douglas Cockerell, with drawings by Noel Rook. Now, the edition I read, I guess, is from 1910. So this is a book that has gone through, or went through, several printings, and I believe there are contemporary printings available today. When I was adding this to my Goodreads, I saw a printing from 2013. So it's definitely an accessible book if you decide that you're interested in reading it. You can get a print copy, you can get a free ebook copy from Project Gutenberg, which is where I read it. So this is, well, it's marketed as a practical guide, but I'm not sure it's all that practical. Practical, perhaps, if you have some pre-existing knowledge of bookbinding, if you have some of these skills already, but if you're like me, for instance, and you've never bound a book in your life and you're not familiar with all the steps that go into that, this is not the sort of practical guide that you can pick up and take it into your workshop or take it into your craft room and just start, binding your own book. It's not that detailed, but it does take you through the basic steps in binding a quality book. And the author here is really concerned with quality bindings, with ensuring that books are bound in not only, an attractive manner, but in a way that will ensure they last. And that way it almost comes across as a bit of a manifesto. A criticism of what he perceived as cheap, shoddy, ineffective book bindings that had emerged at the end of the 19th century when he was writing this. And he's advocating a return when necessary, when you want a book to last, to some of the older methods and materials for binding. He says here, I printed off a chapter of this just because I found it quite interesting and I wanted to save it and underline a bit. But he says here, it is no exaggeration to say that 90% of the books bound in leather during the last 30 years will need rebinding during the next 30. The immense expense involved must be a very serious drag on the usefulness of libraries, and as rebinding is always to be some extent damaging to the leaves of a book, it is not only an account of the expense that the necessity for it is to be regretted. The reasons that have led to the production in modern times of bindings that fail to last for a reasonable time are twofold. The materials are badly selected or prepared, and the method of binding is faulty. Another factor in the decay of bindings, both old and new, is the bad conditions under which they are kept. And so he goes on in this work to explain how to select good materials and which methods are best for binding a book in a way that's going to last. And then he does briefly touch on how to store a book and how to care for it. It's described as a textbook with the best methods for bookbinding and for keeping those books. And I can only guess what he would say about our book bindings today, made en masse by machine and largely made to only last for a couple of years at most. the author here is definitely looking back on early bookbinding and saying, you know, this was the peak of bookbinding. If only we could do that again. This is how you can get close to that. That's what he is doing with this work. And he covers a lot of varied and interesting topics in this book. He raises questions throughout this work about best practices for bookbinding. For instance, he asks, should the decorations on the binding of a book be influenced by the content of a book, or is it completely extra to the book and you're essentially doing whatever you feel like? Or should a binding be very plain? Is gold tooled pattern, is that the correct thing to do? Is that necessary when you're designing a beautiful book? Should books complement the room? Should you be binding books to complement a room? Should you be putting plain books in an ostentatious room, as he suggests? Should you put ostentatious books in a plain room? Or does it matter? Does the binding of a book even matter, or is it just a book? Should cheap bindings be decorated at all, or should fancy, beautiful bindings be reserved for quality bindings? Is it deceptive to make a cheap binding look expensive? He mulls over these sort of questions, and some of them he addresses and provides an answer to, and some he leaves sort of open-ended, letting the reader know that there are these debates within the bookbinding community, so to speak, within the bookbinding trade. One of the things I found interesting was his passage on hollow backs. So he talks about the creation of the hollow back. So originally when books were bound, the pages were sort of flush with the spine, so they were attached directly to the spine. And then eventually a sort of false band was sewn in, and the pages were sewn to that band rather than to the spine itself, creating what we call a hollow back. And a lot of books today have hollow backs, although some, usually paperbacks, don't. But if you get a quality hardcover, they often do have that hollow back. And so he suggests here that the history of the general introduction of hollow backs is probably somewhat as follows. Leather was doubtless first chosen for covering the backs of books because of its toughness and flexibility, because while protecting the back, it would bend when the book was opened and allow the back to throw up. When gold tooling became common, the backs of books were elaborately decorated. It was found that the creasing of the leather injured the brightness or the gold and caused it to crack. To avoid this, the binders lined up the back until it was as stiff as a block of wood. The back would then not throw up as the book was opened. The leather would not be creased and the gold would remain uninjured. This was all very well for the gold, but a book so treated does not open fully, and indeed, if the paper is stiff, can hardly be got to open at all. To overcome both difficulties, the hollow back was introduced, and as projecting bands would have been in the way, the sewing cord was sunk in saw cuts made across the back of the book. So that is his understanding of the history behind the creation of that hollow back, and it does make sense if you've altered the way you're binding a book in order to protect all the fancy gold inlay you're putting on the spine and on the rest of the book. You're going to run into another difficulty that you need to find a solution for, because of course you want your book to open fully so that you can read it. So that was interesting to read about. He says the use of hollow backs was a very ingenious way out of the difficulty, as with them the backs could be made to throw up, and at the same time the leather was not disturbed. The method of sawing in bands was known for a long time before the general use of hollow backs. It has widely been used to avoid the raised bands on books covered with embroidered material. So yeah, there are still books created with raised bands, but typically those raised bands are false, they're fake. They're added to the outside binding, to the leather, to make it look like it's an older style of book. So it's interesting to just read about the evolution of how books have been bound. He also covers other topics like sewing frames, the use of that, how to paste down end papers, the best method for adding titles to the spines of books, and when using a clasp is necessary. So when you think of really old medieval books especially, you think of a big leather-bound book with a giant metal clasp. And the clasp was often included, and he says, you still want to use that clasp when you're making a book if you have paper that's made of vellum. So vellum is, well, it's not really paper, but vellum is a paper-like material made from the skins of animals, and it was widely used before the kind of paper we use today was invented. But I guess the problem with that is if it's not kept flat and compressed by the weight of all the other pages and the covers in the book, it's apt, as he says, if not kept flat, it's apt to cockle. So it's apt to pucker or wrinkle. And so in order to keep the paper, the vellum, flat, you want to add that clasp to create that pressure to keep the book laying flat and keep the pages in a good condition. So yeah, there's all sorts of interesting bits of book history in here. If you're interested in how books are made, how they were made, this is perhaps a work you might be interested in, but I greatly enjoyed it. And just through browsing Project Gutenberg, I realized there were other works from the era on similar subjects. So I may be diving into some of those in the future. If you've read this work, or if you know of any similar works that might interest me, please let me know in the comments below. Or if you got some knowledge in your mind, share with me an interesting fact about bookbinding or an interesting anecdote. I hope you have a lovely evening.